This leads me to, it's a good segue to the next section, explaining not only understanding the data ourselves, but also explaining the data to other people. We need to also ask ourselves who we are visualizing for. The way that I usually explain this to my students is that it is not the same thing to design a visualization that is going to be published, say, in a scientific paper, than designing that same visualization to be published in a newspaper or a magazine, just because there are different types of audience. Those are two different, completely different types of audiences, right? And the audiences will have different knowledge levels about the data that you're presenting or about the types of graphics that you're using to visualize the data. So I care a lot about these. I care a lot about people's understanding visualizations. A while ago, there was a survey conducted by the Pew Research Center here in the United States that asked a sample of United States citizens, United States people, several questions about science. And one of those questions was related to a chart, to a data visualization. This data visualization that you have on the screen over here, this is called a scatter plot, as you may know. Scatter plot, in this case, x-axis and y-axis. Those dots, each one of those dots represents a country. The position on the horizontal axis represents the average sugar consumption per person and day in each one of those countries. So the further to the right a dot is, the more sugar people in those countries tend to consume on average. And then the position on the vertical axis corresponds to the average number of decayed teeth among people in that country. So as you can see, there is sort of like a vague positive association between sugar consumption, and an average number of decayed teeth, right? We cannot establish causation, but there's certainly an association between one number and the other number. Well, what the Pew Research Center discovered was that 63% of people who were presented with this graphic could understand this chart correctly. And by understanding, they meant understanding their chart sort of like at the grammatical level, being able to understand that there's a horizontal axis and a vertical axis, and the position on those axes meant something, right? 63% of people were able to do that. Now, the other 37%, more than 1/3 of people who were presented with this graphic could not understand this graphic. Some of them, for example, understood this graphic as if it were showing change over time, for instance, even if there is no time in the graphic at all. So they got it wrong in that sense. Well, we know that there are many people out there who have a hard time understanding complex and unusual data and novel data visualizations. And some designers, some editors, some decision makers say, well, if I know that my reader is not going to understand this type of graphic, I shouldn't use this type of graphic. I think that that is a self-defeating strategy, because obviously, if you never use that type of graphic, your readers will never understand that type of graphic, right? You need to do something else. If you believe that a type of graphic is the best way to represent a story or to show a story, it is your responsibility to use that graphic, to use that type of graphic, but then to explain how to read it, to explain how to read that graphic to your reader. If you really believe that, in this case, for example, the scatter plot is the best way to represent your data. So that explanation, textual, verbal, whatever it is, we call that in visualization the annotation layer. The annotation layer is the verbal elements that we include in visualization. It could be titles, explanations, annotations and explainers of different kinds, etc. It can also be verbal. It can also be spoken. One of the best speakers about data visualization, probably most of you are familiar with his work, was Hans Rosling, the famous Swedish medical doctor and statistician who became famous in 2006 thanks to several presentations that he gave at the TED conferences and other places. In my opinion, Rosling was one of the best presenters that I have ever seen. And if you are not familiar with his work, I would greatly recommend that you visit his website, gapminder.org, and you take a look at some of his lectures. I'm going to show you just a very brief snippet of one of his presentations, in this case that he made for a documentary that he did for the BBC in the United Kingdom. In this documentary, in one of the scenes of the documentary that deals with the statistics, the title of the documentary is The Joy of Stats, Hans Rosling appears on the screen and he says, I'm going to talk a little bit about the world. But before I show you anything, be aware there is going to be a chart, and the chart has a vertical axis. And the position of things on the vertical axis means life expectancy. There is also going to be a horizontal axis, and the position on the horizontal axis means income, the level of income of several countries. That means that if your country is down here, it means that your country is on average poor and sick. If you're up here, it means that your country is rich and healthy on average. So let's take a look at what the world looked like in the past, in 1810. Let's make the countries appear. Each one of the countries will be a dot. The dots will be colored according to continent. Red is Asia, blue is Europe, and so on and so forth. So as you can see, all of them appeared. And then the size of the bubble is proportional to the population of that country in that particular year. So as you can see, in 1810, all countries are down here, meaning that on average, they are poor and sick. The highest life expectancies were in countries like the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, etc., that had a life expectancy of 40 years. But then if we start moving towards the present, if we start advancing time, we will see that this bubble will start moving more towards the right-hand side, meaning that average income increases, and also life expectancy also start increasing. As you can see, this is happening. Now, I could go on and on. The talk is a lot of fun. You should watch it when you have the chance. But I would like to go back to the very beginning and emphasize what it is that Rosling was doing at the very beginning. What he did at the very beginning was not to show any data. First of all, he explained how to read the graphic. Vertical axis, horizontal axis, each one of the dots represents a country. Yeah, the dots will appear there. The color represents the continent, and the bubble size represents the population. If you think about it, these are the encodings of the data visualization. The term encoding is critical in data visualization. The encodings are the properties of objects that we change in order to represent the data. Encodings could be position, it could be area, it could be color. Those are the encodings in data visualization. So Rosling, before he presented any data, he explained the grammar of the graphic that he was about to present. I never had the opportunity to ask Rosling about this particular video, but my guess was that he did that explanation before showing any data because he knew that a substantial portion of his viewers in this case probably will have a very low visual literacy, right? That creates huge inequalities. So he wanted to overcome that inequality, but by educating people on how to read this type of graphic, there is a lot of value in doing that. Lots and lots of value in doing that, because the next time that a viewer of this documentary sees a scatter plot, they will be able to read a scatter plot. Now, some visualization designers say that one of the most important things that we do as visualization designers is not the visualization itself, is the explainers that we add to the visualization, what I called before the annotation layer. John Bourne Murdoch, for example, who is one of the most popular visualization designers at the Financial Times, in my opinion, one of the gold standards in data journalism nowadays. In one interview that you can read later when you have access to the slides, he says that at the Financial Times, in the data department of the Financial Times, they think that one of their most important jobs is not even the visualizations. The visualizations are important, obviously, but what they consider more important is that annotation layer that helps put the data in context, that helps explain the data, that helps explain how to read certain types of graphics that may be complicated for an average reader. Because the purpose in these cases, I would say, is not just to present that data of that particular graphic. It is also to expand readers' vocabulary, visual vocabulary, so they will be more educated, better educated to face that type of graphic, those types of graphics presented to them better in the future.